nice introduction. So I think the one sort of thing I wanted to say before we get rolling is that my department is like 2/3 economists, so I'm used to interruptions. I don't mind interruptions. We don't actually have to finish the whole talk. Like it's fine. And yeah, the other thing is that this is like the only piece of research that I've made any progress on, because all I do is sit in meetings now. So if it's like awful, then blame the meetings, and if it's good, it's because I'm actually like focusing for once in my life. And this is co-authored with my buddy Los Anderson, who's at the Rockwell Foundation Research Unit. He's the person who got the data on conditions of confinement, and he and I have sort of a series of projects on that. Okay, so let me give you kind of a basic sense of where we're going to go. I'm just going to give you sort of a little bit of an introduction to the kind of broader agenda that I'm trying to push with this specific area, and then we'll talk a little bit about the current project. So we'll talk about definitions, motivation, and the basic argument, which is going to be super simple and straightforward. I like hate the lit review portion of talks in general. Like I have no attention span, and so mine tend to be pretty short. And then we'll talk a little bit about the data analytics strategy and findings, and then talk about some conclusions and limitations. If we get that far. Again, totally cool to interrupt. Okay, so I guess most of my work has really focused on kind of documenting the prevalence and consequences of mass incarceration. A lot of that work has used synthetic cohort life tables to try to estimate the prevalence of that events, but some of it has looked at effects as well. And so a lot of the work in this sort of mass incarceration literature, I think, kind of takes a couple of things really seriously. So anything around obstacles to causal inference within the mass incarceration literature is something that folks have really kind of fixated on. I think the implications of mass incarceration for inequality has long been something that we've focused on, and I think there's been increasing emphasis on sort of the spillover effects of mass incarceration for families. So those are kind of three of the core sorts of areas that I think we've really focused on. But one of the things that has been interesting is within sociology, demography, and economics, and to a lesser degree within criminology, folks really haven't focused on conditions of confinement at all. And when you do actually see any studies on conditions of confinement that are within those kind of core social science disciplines, what you tend to see is not particularly well executed papers that are focused on prison visitation and what drives prison visitation and what effects prison visitation has on folks who are incarcerated and then their families. And I think I didn't want to put this on a slide, but I think there are really good reasons to expect conditions of confinement to matter a lot. Both in the short term and then also in terms of post-release outcomes. So I think there's a really kind of pragmatic reason to focus on it. But the other thing that I think we should think about, for those of us who are trying to minimize the consequences of mass incarceration for society, is that the probability of the incarceration rate getting back down to 1973 levels, which is when the incarceration rate really started to increase, is very, very, very low. And even if we get back to that point, it's going to take a long, long, long time. And so during this period where we're subjected to high incarceration rates, a key way to sort of diminish those effects is by really focusing on things that we can modify quickly, and conditions of confinement actually end up being one of those things. This is like a super unpopular argument to probably a third of the room, would be my guess. I mean, prison abolitionists. What do you mean by conditions of confinement? Yeah, so that is a great question. So conditions of confinement could be everything from the cells that people are in, to the proportion of folks who are in solitary confinement, to the food that people are served, to the jobs, to the programming that they're exposed to. So like the whole range of things. So literally anything that kind of touches them while they're in the system, I think is how we think of it. And And so I do think this is something that we should really be focusing on a bunch. I wrote an annual review of law and social science piece that has never been cited with my buddy Maria Fitzpatrick, who's an economist, and then my student Alyssa, who's on the market this year, where we basically sort of make a case for thinking about conditions of confinement. And there we lay out in more detail sort of all the different things, partially as a way for people to think about how we can modify mundane conditions of confinement that could actually be really relevant for folks who are exposed to those conditions for years and years and years. Like, I think most of the things that we focus on in terms of conditions of confinement are things like solitary or sexual assault or sort of violence in facilities more broadly. But as we all know from our own sort of work and home environments, things that actually seem pretty mundane can actually have a really large, both short-term and long-term implications for our well-being. And so we've been trying to push that. All right, anyway, that's like about as broad an overview as I ever give. So, okay, so what do we do in the current project? So the kind of key research question that we're trying to answer here is, how does being placed in disciplinary segregation affect core prisoner reentry outcomes? And so what we're trying to do with this paper, which has a second R&R at criminology, and if it doesn't get through, I'm going to lose my mind. But it's like been so much work. So what we've been trying to think about doing is saying, typically when folks talk about solitary confinement, they're talking about it in ways in which criminologists don't care about in the ways that they should. So they talk about the ethical dimensions or the medical dimensions. They vary, or the mental health dimensions. They very rarely try to link solitary confinement to core prisoner reentry outcomes. And so what we're trying to do in this project is to say, essentially, hey, folks who are working within core criminology, you need to think about this as something that's right within your wheelhouse as well. So, which is maybe an overly practical kind of move, but is something that we feel like is missing. We focus on 3 years after release from a correctional facility, just because that tends to be sort of what folks in corrections use as one of the core kind of times. Okay, so we think that this paper makes 3 contributions. So first, ties solitary confinement explicitly to prisoner reentry, which we think is a key kind of issue. The other thing that it does is it really focuses on short-term exposure to solitary confinement instead of really, really long-term exposure. So a lot of the folks in our data, as one of the tables which has a font that's too small for you to see will show you / not show you, is that the vast majority of folks in our sample have been in for just 3 to 7 days. So these aren't folks who are in a supermax facility for years and years and years. They're folks who are in for a relatively short period of time because of specific disciplinary infractions. And so theoretically, there are alternate ways that you could deal with those disturbances in the facility other than solitary confinement. And then the other thing that I've thought about a bit is, so within the incarceration literature, there's this basic idea that incarceration has detrimental effects. Yeah, that was surprising to me too when I ate one. It was more mint than I had bargained for. I was hoping for peanut butter. Sorry, I really like candy. Now I totally lost my train of thought. So within the incarceration literature, there are kind of 3 primary reasons that folks talk about folks who have been formerly incarcerated not doing well in the labor market, for instance, to take sort of the example that there's been the most research on. So there's selection into correctional facilities, right? So folks who end up in prisons and jails would have had worse labor market outcomes than average, even if they hadn't experienced incarceration. There's the stigma attached to incarceration, right? And people think of that as being a key driver. But then the third thing that folks talk about is incarceration-related transformation. But we very rarely sort of actually try to think about a condition of confinement or a specific feature of the incarceration experience that could actually transform someone in discernible ways that could affect their outcomes. And so I think what we've been trying to think about in terms of this paper is like, this is a really specific thing that happens in prison or jail where nobody on the outside is going to know about it. And so there's not going to be any additional stigma beyond the stigma attached to being a formerly incarcerated person. And so any negative effects that we see on those reentry outcomes would actually have to be driven by transformation rather than the stigma attached to it.
Is there no selection issue there? The people who suffer solitary confinement might be somebody more?
So are you reviewer 5? Yeah, no, so there are massive selection issues, and we sort of do our best to try to deal with them. Basically what we do is we use a match difference in difference, where the difference in difference reference group that we're working with is folks who received a sanction for a very similar type of offense but weren't actually placed in solitary. There are other things that we've been thinking about doing. So theoretically, we could do something with rotational assignment of folks who are working in correctional facilities to find exogenous variation in the probability of being placed. So Danes are super awesome about giving over their data, but they did not, they were unwilling to do that. And then the other thing theoretically that you could do, and that does happen in some US systems for disciplinary infractions, is you could think about, there's sort of a disciplinary severity sort of score that you could have, and you could compare folks who are red on one side of the line or the other. But we're not able to do those things in this paper, so we do the match definitive.
The match definitive is different people that are matched with characteristics?
Yep, that's right. Okay, other questions? I'm so happy for interruptions because I associate all lack of interruptions with the sociology candidates who come in to our department to interview for jobs, and then the economists have decided within 3 minutes that it's just a no-go, and it's just deathly silent. This is not a job interview, so it doesn't have that same emotional resonance, but it's not something that, anyway, it could go badly, I just don't want it to go that bad. Okay, so definitions and motivations. So what's solitary confinement? I think we all have some kind of prior, but just establishing this a bit. So the basic idea is that when folks who are incarcerated are kept in their cells on their own for 22 to 24 hours a day, getting out only for sort of recreation and the occasional shower. So eating meals in the cell, often doing recreation in sort of a little area that's right off the cell. So someone being kept on their own for sort of a really extended period of time. I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why teasing out the causal effect of solitary confinement is really challenging, but I don't think there's any debate about whether being in solitary confinement, even for a short period of time, is pretty awful. I mean, I think certainly you see some narratives around sort of transformation that happened during a solitary confinement spell in a positive way, but almost everyone who's been in solitary describes it as this totally psychologically devastating, awful sort of experience. Yep.
So maybe you're talking more about this, but that's the mechanism here, is that it has long-term psychological damage, not it's sort of that it breeds, institutional resentment or loss of confidence in the system, or how do they use an example of a person?
Yeah.
What is the path?
So we think of damaged mental health as being sort of a core kind of driver, but there are a couple other things that could potentially be working. So one thing that we think could also be working is disruptions in programming. Even relatively short periods of time outside of the general population could disrupt sort of the way that folks are engaging with a mental health treatment sort of module, or thinking about employment or those sorts of things. So we think that could be a driver. The other thing, and this is something that Lars has talked to folks in Danish correctional facilities, and they say isn't a driver there, so it's not listed on the little mechanism slide in a minute. But the other thing that he and I thought both could be working is that it leads to this sort of label of being a problem prisoner, and that then following sort of classic labeling theory could end up to this sort of spiraling effect. And so it could actually be that there's a stigma attached to the event, but it's internal rather than external in the way that we typically think about it. So, but yeah, I think based on the evidence that's already there, we think mental health is the key sort of driver. We don't have a great way to test that with these data, though. Other questions?
You're gonna talk about how people get into it? Why people get into it?
Yes. Yeah, let's see. Well, yeah, we will. We'll talk about it eventually. And then the other thing is that the experience of solitary does certainly vary across context, but it does look like in most countries the experience of solitary confinement is relatively similar. Again, differences especially in the duration of exposure to it, but what it actually sort of feels like to be in solitary confinement looks like it is sort of a similar thing. Yeah?
Does solitary have other consequences? Like, do people end up staying longer do they have their sentences increased?
Yeah, so there, so it can be counted against you for parole. So it could affect both when you're eligible to go up for parole initially, and then also the parole decision. I haven't seen particularly great tests of that yet in criminology. But yeah, it could affect a whole sort of host of other things. Basically, the criminology literature right now looks at mental health, and then there's stuff on repeated disciplinary infractions. But that's not where it is. Other questions?
Sure. So we all think solitary confinement is bad. Presumably, in prisons also think it's bad. Prison administrators, people signing it. Is there a misunderstanding by them that they don't have the right information, or are they doing this despite knowing that this is terrible?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think if you talk to folks who work in corrections, well, let's talk about the three different kinds, because I think that'll be helpful. So there are three basic kinds of solitary confinement. There's protective segregation, administrative segregation, and disciplinary segregation. So protective segregation, which is also called protective custody, is either when someone specifically requests to be in solitary confinement because of fears for their own safety, or when the facility decides that someone's at sufficient risk that they will preemptively put them in solitary confinement before they experience an assault or something like that. So that's kind of one kind. A second kind, which is more amorphous, is administrative segregation. And there, the basic idea is that someone is seen as being a threat broadly defined or incapable of thriving in the prison environment, broadly defined. It's much more amorphous. Everybody who's in a supermax facility is technically an administrative segregation in the US. So the folks who are exposed for really, really, really long periods of time, that's administrative segregation rather than disciplinary segregation. Yeah?
Are you able to distinguish the data?
So we are. So
So
only.
you can look across the different types.
So we only have disciplinary segregation.
Okay.
In the data. Protective custody in Denmark, the ends get too small within facilities for them to be able to release the data to us. So it's there are some facilities where it's under the 10 threshold or whatever. And then administrative segregation is like a totally different thing that they're completely unwilling to give us data on. And our suspicion is that, so there's this like, historically it would have been called like a hospital for the criminally insane. That's right on the outskirts of Copenhagen. And our hypothesis has been that that's where most of the folks in administrative segregation are, and that Denmark wants to keep its good reputation in terms of facilities. So it's been, anyway, so we only have disciplinary segregation here. Yeah?
I came late, so I might have missed this, but do all of the prisons in Denmark have solitary confinement?
Yep. So local jails in Denmark have solitary confinement. In fact, most folks who are in local jails in Denmark are technically in solitary confinement because they're worried about collusion. Closed prisons and open prisons also have solitary confinement in Denmark. So even the most open of the systems there have it.
Do they look different at the different levels, or?
So the solitary cells themselves are virtually identical across facilities. So they will all have sort of a small wing that's usually about 10 cells, where it's virtually identical across facilities. And it's pretty jarring because open prisons and closed prisons in Denmark look super, super, super different. And so the contrast in an open prison between the general kind of population and the solitary cells is really stark.
What's an open prison?
So an open prison, so many questions. It's good. I do actually, I'm like gleeful when I don't get to the results in talks. I have idiosyncratic preferences. So open prisons are prisons where you need to be there at night. So during sort of sleeping hours, you have to be there, but that you're able to leave for pre-approved activities. So educational activities, employment activities. You could be able to leave to visit family for an extended period of time. So I guess I would think of, the way I think about it is, it is still a prison. I mean, you're still in prison, and but it's more kind of porous. So you can move more freely in society, and it's not like, I think it's easy to think about being able to go to work and being able to go to classes and stuff like that, and think of it as being like really rigidly monitored. It doesn't work the way something like electronic monitoring would work in the US, where like if you're 15 minutes late or if you deviate slightly from a normal path, then you could immediately get locked up. It's basically trying to help people that haven't committed or haven't been convicted of very serious crimes be as ready as possible to go back into general society. Okay. And then the third kind, and what we're going to focus on today, is disciplinary segregation. And disciplinary segregation, essentially what happens is you get a ticket for a specific infraction, and then there's a hearing, and based on that hearing, there's a decision about whether there wasn't actually an infraction, whether there was an infraction, and you'll get some other sort of sanction, loss of privileges, or a small fine, or something like that, or whether you'll be placed in solitary confinement. And so that's kind of the key idea behind disciplinary segregation. Interesting factoid about disciplinary segregation in Denmark, which is thankfully after our data cut off, but if you get caught with a cell phone 3 times in Denmark, in prison, you get a mandatory 28-day stint in solitary confinement, which seems like, I like usually look befuddled in a positive way when I'm in Denmark talking about the criminal justice system, but that's one where it just seems, especially when you see how short the average duration is. Okay, let's not talk about the US. So solitary confinement's effects, I think, are interesting for a couple kind of key reasons. So there are these sort of ethical objections, right? This is the thing that I think we hear about a bunch. Josh, there are these sort of pragmatic kind of concerns that you raised, which is it's really expensive, but we don't have a real good sense about the sort of total costs and benefits associated with doing it. So you could see, do you need water? You could see if solitary confinement, massively decreased the level of violence in facilities, that could maybe offset, but we don't have a real good sense of that, and so there are pragmatic reasons to focus on it. And then there are also sort of more theoretical reasons, and I don't really like theory, so we're gonna skip that. Okay, so Danny, to your point, here's sort of the way that we're thinking about the mechanism. So we're thinking about these kind of key features of solitary confinement having really well-established effects on mental health problems, and that's sort of where the bulk of the literature is, but these other pieces could also have effects on mental health problems. And then the lack of programming could have a direct effect on poor labor market outcomes and recidivism risks, but then we're thinking of mental health problems as kind of the key driver here. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but the one thing, and this is actually nice because it's based on a Danish sample, but I think most of the work on solitary confinement has focused on folks who are in for years or even decades. So talking about really, really, really prolonged exposure. And there's this interesting study which looked at folks in Denmark who would have similar durations of exposure to what we have in the data we have. And the author finds, so she says, the symptoms often occur after only a few days. Most common are problems of concentration, restlessness, failure of memory, sleeping problems, an impaired sense of time and ability to follow the rhythm of day and night. Nightmares and anxiety are very common. Suicide attempts are often made. And although it's not sort of stated as explicitly later in the article, her impression is that there were sort of long-term within facility effects on mental health. Didn't follow anybody after release, but so even these short stints in her study did find these sort of longer term effects. Okay, so let's move to the data. And then we can go back to the mechanisms or the sort of quotes from folks on what they found. So we use Danish registry data, and then we pair it with a whole bunch of information on conditions of confinement in all Danish prisons and jails. We study 2006 to 2013 for the confinement period, and then we follow folks through the end of 2017 or a 3-year window, whichever happens first. So the outcomes that we focus on here are the cumulative probability of ever being employed in the 3-year period, and the cumulative probability of being convicted of a new crime. I don't have them in the extra slides, so I can't show them to you now. But if you would like our 70-page supplementary online appendix, I can send it your way. So we look at a whole bunch of other labor market outcomes and criminal justice contact outcomes. But these are the ones that we focus on. Just to flag something to think about this contextually. So you would think that almost everybody would be employed at some point within a 3-year period. And even in the US, where rates of employment among folks who have been incarcerated at some point are really low, still the majority of folks will have been employed at some point in the formal labor market within 3 years after release. In the Danish context, labor market participation rates for folks who experience criminal justice contact are very, very, very low. And this was the core kind of feature of labor market attachment that correctional officials were most interested in. And so that was why we focused on that. We can talk about other outcomes that we looked at as well. Okay, so I think in addition to some of the reasons that we've talked about already, there are a couple other reasons to focus on disciplinary segregation specifically. So I think the first is that relative to administrative segregation, where there's this sort of amorphous kind of reason that folks end up there often, and protective custody, I think we can actually think about modifying its use, and I think we can get correctional officials to think about modifying how much they're using it. The other thing is that, so there's like, the statistics on these things are really bad, but just thinking about how long the average duration of exposure to the different types of segregation is, the vast majority of folks who are re-entering society from a correctional facility who have been in solitary confinement will have been in disciplinary segregation rather than these other forms of segregation. And so if we're thinking about like the total amount of churning through solitary confinement that's happening for folks who are rapidly re-entering society. Disciplinary segregation is sort of a core feature. And then anyone can experience disciplinary segregation regardless of how short their sentence is. And some of the sentences in Denmark are 30 days where someone experienced disciplinary segregation. And so the amount of time that's often going to happen between disciplinary segregation placement and reentry is going to be pretty small. So, okay. So the strategy we use, as I mentioned before, is we use a match, diff and diff. And we use those who are sanctioned for a disciplinary infraction but not placed in solitary as sort of our reference group. And then we have like a gazillion controls. And then we show all results for open prisons, closed prisons, and local jails, as well as showing sort of pooled results across all facilities simultaneously, just to give you a sense of where things are. For all the, since we're using matching as a first stage, we also show results across a whole bunch of different types of matching procedures, mostly just so you can see how the confidence intervals and point estimates jump around. So in all the figures you see, the N of observations will be on the x-axis, and then the y-axis will be the point estimates. So mostly just trying to make sure that you have a sense of why confidence intervals are increasing. Yeah?
So can you say again, what is the difference here? It's not a before after design, it can't be.
So it's looking at the difference in their number or their probability of being convicted for a new crime in the 3 years before they experienced incarceration, removing the year in which they could have been sentenced, and the 3 years after. Yeah, so it is. Okay. It is. To be totally frank, we could only do this in the Danish context because the sentences are so short. If we tried to do something like this within the US context, you'd end up with a really, really, really super select sample because you'd have to go far enough back that folks really could have sort of aged out of criminal activity. But within the Danish context, the vast majority of these folks who have been in before is relatively short stints. So that's the way we're doing it.
It's sort of 2 points in time, though. I mean, there's not like a pre-trend of, or is there a pre-trend of employment here?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I know, but okay. But if it's a cumulative probability of employment, that's harder to.
Yeah. So I mean, we've tried to do it sort of a host of different ways, but looking at monthly. So basically, we have really, really good monthly data for recidivism. So we have really good monthly data for criminal justice context, but the data are quarterly, I think, in terms of employment. So, yeah. And I guess the thing that I would say here is we're not sort of saying that it's a causal estimate, but we are saying that we're pushing the envelope within this broader literature. So this is a strong design relative to sort of what's out there, thinking about solitary confinement's consequences. Okay, Josh, finally get your answer in tiny, tiny font so you can't see it. So I think that the key thing to focus on here is that the vast majority of folks end up in disciplinary segregation or getting other sanctions for 3 types of offenses. Possessing drugs or weapons. The vast majority of those are possessing drugs, not possessing weapons. Possessing illegal goods, which are almost exclusively cell phones. So about 40%, 30 to 40% of both. Possessing illegal goods is possessing cell phones. And then violating facility-specific rules, which when you talk to correctional officials in Denmark, I don't know if it would be the same in the US, but it basically means like persistently being a pain in the ass. Like that's that's literally, I don't know how to say that in Danish, but that's what the Danish correctional officials that Lars sort of talked to think about it. So between those three, about 70 to 80%, or those three involve about 70 or 80% of both of these things. We weren't able to get information on what specific infraction the folks who were incarcerated had been tried for within the facility. So we can't actually do something there, but the heavy overlap between the infraction types, I think, makes us feel like it's at least moving in the right.
Violence is what?
So violence is, where is it? So violence would be, violence is violating the penal code. Is where that one would go. And so 13% of folks who are in restrictive housing, so that's where there's a big difference versus other sanctions. Yeah, and I mean that would be the one that we would be most worried about. But there's nothing we can do since we don't have. Okay, so just to move through the results relatively quickly. So there are big descriptive differences both before and after in terms of the probability of being convicted and then also in terms of employment.
And so can you just walk us through one of these?
Sure. Let me find the little clicker thing. So, so the top, this is folks who experience punishment cell confinement, so are placed in disciplinary segregation. Mm-hmm. This is their probability of being convicted. These are their monthly probabilities of being convicted before. This is folks who experienced other disciplinary actions. So these are folks who are convicted for some in-prison infraction or in-facility infraction, but who didn't end up in solitary confinement. And this is folks who didn't experience any in-facility infractions either way. So we've just tossed those from our results entirely. And they're included mostly just to give you a sense of the fact that some of the selection were theoretically able to.
So this means these people were all in prison for 3 years at least?
So these folks weren't all in prison for 3 years. This is in the 2 years before, or sorry, this is the year before they went to prison. We don't look at that at all. And then this is the 2 years before that time. So that's what we're using for the pre. And then all the time that they're in the correctional facility, we're just treating as time zero.
Yeah, the reason, I mean, I was a little puzzled by the before measurement for those as conviction because everyone looking at it as a conviction. But you're saying that the sentences are so short that you could have had a prior conviction that was more than a year out from your current prison stay. You could have come back out again.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So that's going to be, I think 80 to 90% of prison sentences in Denmark are less than a year.
Okay.
So it's the vast majority. And actually one of the reasons, so with this paper, but with a lot of the stuff we do with the registry data in general, we're really pushed to focus just on closed prisons because they align most closely with what we think about as a prison in the US. And the reason we explicitly don't do that in most of our work is because the folks who end up in closed prisons in Denmark, which is where the vast majority of the sentences over a year are, these are folks who have been in many times, often for pretty serious crimes. Yeah?
It seems like when you're thinking about the generalizability of these results elsewhere, a big part of it is the difference between what we know is so terrible about solitary and the relative, like a short 1 year sentence here is obviously so anomalous. So like I wonder if you could maybe look at heterogeneity across open and closed to just sort of get a sense for how much the baseline conditions of confinement are important relative to the solitary.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, that's. Part of why we tried to focus on disciplinary segregation is just because we think the generalizability is stronger for that sort of segregation than the other ones, but
I just mean heterogeneity by open versus closed.
yeah. Oh, in the effects.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna show those.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't convey that clearly before. That's my fault.
You
I
want
need to get
5 more
moving.
Yeah.
All right.
Did you say breaking in men and women?
So there are so few.
No women.
Yeah. I mean, it would be super interesting. All right. Okay. Matching helps, sort of. I hate matching. Okay. So these are just the differences in the propensity to experience solitary confinement before and after matching, and then these little crosses are the differences between the groups in all the covariates that went into the model before we did matching, and then the black dots are afterwards. So if you like matching, then this is good matching. If you don't like matching, that's fine too. So the main results, this is what you wanted, right, Muller? Okay, so these are the sort of main results, and what you see, so this is the cumulative probability of being convicted of a new crime. So this is all facilities, closed prisons, open prisons, and local jails. And what you see is that the point estimates are relatively stable between about 5% and about 7.5%. I should say the baseline probability among these groups of being convicted of a new crime is about 40 to 50% within 3 years after. So these are both substantively large and statistically significant effects. We don't see a lot of evidence of heterogeneity across facilities in terms of the effect. I mean, one thing that we have thought about a bit, so there are folks who experience solitary confinement in multiple different types of facilities, and so we could try to focus just on folks who experience it in only one type of facility. So those are the recidivism estimates. Here are the employment estimates. So what you see is when you pull across all facilities, it looks like there's about a 3 to 5% decrease in the probability of being employed at all in the 3-year period. Closed prisons are just a disaster. The bounds are huge. The point estimates are about the same, but the confidence intervals are really large. And then open prisons and local jails, the confidence intervals again are larger than they are in all facilities, but the point estimates are relatively similar. So I mean, I guess the way that we've been interpreting these is that we feel relatively confident that there's a real potential causal effect in terms of the cumulative probability of being convicted of a new crime, but that it's less consistent on the employment side. I should say for earnings, this is way closer to a null rather than a noisy but potentially important effect. Yeah?
Are you able to see the type of offense for the new conviction?
Yeah, we are. So they're mostly so we see a big increase both for violent crimes and then also for drug-related crimes. We don't see any increase in DUI, which is actually why a lot of people end up in correctional facilities in Denmark. Okay, so yeah, anyway, we break things down by pretrial detention too. So,
did you dose? How long you're in?
So we didn't do dosage just because the range is relatively small. We could look at it, but we'd have to bin it.
So how long are people in?
So about 50% of folks are in less than 4 days, and then almost everybody else after that is in less than a week. The number of folks who are in between 1 and 4 weeks is relatively small. Muller's so disgusted he's about to leave. Okay, anyway, there are some conclusions, there are some limitations I don't want to go over. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes before 1 and a couple minutes after 1. So let's start on that.
Yeah. Since it's Denmark and you know everything about
I wish.
do you also have mental health data on that afterwards?
So we do have mental health data, but only of a very limited variety. So with the different subregisters of the Danish registry data, you have to have a pre-approved project to link the different registers. And so we have approval for this project to link to hospital admissions because of a mental health episode, but we don't have access to prescription fills, which is basically how folks usually do things. So in a perfect world, we would have that information and then we'd be able to figure it out. I mean, I am on an endless campaign, which is mostly irritating to my boss in Denmark, about how stories like this are actually the perfect reason that we need to have some sort of survey data collection that can be married with the administrative data so that you can actually think about teasing out mechanisms in a way that we almost always can't with the registry data. But yeah, so that would be something that we'd like to do and that we asked to do and that we were not allowed to do. Yeah?
You mentioned this big policy shock that happens after your study, and I'm asking you to talk about something that your study is not about. But it seems like if the vast majority of people are in solitary for less than a week, and there's a lot of self-owned offenses, and self-owned offenses are now mandatory 28 days, that would be a huge increase in just like total solitary confinement. Do you see sort of comparable like aggregate shifts in the sort of general population following the policy, given that sort of you see that solitary should affect people in these ways? There's a huge increase in the number of people who experience the policy. Theoretically, outcomes in general should fall.
So it's still too early to tell. The policy shock was relatively recent. And the incarceration rate is so low in Denmark that I think seeing aggregate effects would be hard. But it would be an interesting thing to evaluate. No, it's a good idea. Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your main reservations about the result is, and in particular, I would imagine the big problem is unobserved characteristics that differentiate people, personality differences, risk attitudes, and so on.
So theoretically, the modeling strategy that we use deals with unobserved but stable traits over the period. The thing that has been more concerning to me is that there could be a certain kind of person who doesn't thrive in a correctional facility, and that person's mental health and behavior erode more quickly than someone who has this sort of other characteristic, and that leads them to come into contact with, or that leads them to commit more disciplinary infractions that then end up putting them in solitary. But it's something that is a fixed characteristic of the person, but that only gets activated in a specific type of facility. That's the core sort of things based on Loss's kind of qualitative interviews with correctional facilities is that they think some number of these folks it's doing harm, but some number of these folks are just kind of falling apart before, and being placed in solitary confinement is a symptom of that rather than having a causal effect. So that's the thing that is concerning to me that we can't tease out in the data with the way we have them. Yeah.
Do we have any, I'm trying to see questions from back of the room.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you have any data on the capacity or like the occupancy rates of solitary confinement, so I would think it'd be like sort of limited, and then you could look at if there's a high occupancy rate period, people that can commit like the infractions that they got the censure for during those times, because that might be like a better match to convince
Yep.
reviewer number 5.
Yep. Reviewer number 5, well, unless reviewer number 5 is in this room, but if reviewer number 5 is who I think he is, reviewer number 5 hates me personally, and so he's just, like, massively screwed. So the occupancy rates is something that we pushed them on, and they were willing to give us facility level occupancy rates, but not sub-facility level occupancy rates. Yeah, no, because that would be another better strategy than what we employed here. And I think so. We also have data on all. So this is for a totally different project. It's just data that I like spent a bunch of time getting and then never used. So we have information on all conditions of confinement of Pennsylvania prisoners. From 1995 to 2013, I think. And with those data, we could calculate occupancy rates because we know where everyone is on every given day, and we know how many solitary cells there are in each facility. And so theoretically, we could use that strategy to tease out the effects of disciplinary segregation in that context. We just need we need more humans on our projects. It's just me and Maria at this point, and we just can't do it. This is a great question, though. All right, someone else from the back, since Josh said back. Danny. All right, Danny.
I'll throw my voice. Okay. So I mean,
can you actually do that?
Yeah, I definitely can.
Really?
Yeah. This is back to Josh's question.
Sure.
Okay, cool. So solitary confinement is bad on average for people. Now I'm a prison administrator, and I want you to tell me who I should send.
Yep.
On the cost-benefit analysis. So that sounds like a machine learning job or something horrible like that. So can you talk a bit about how you might, think about that in a much more like sort of prison practice kind of approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I don't think based on this, I can talk about it much, so I can just talk about it anecdotally. I mean, I think the key thing that you could do within a correctional context is to train correctional officials to deal with inmates who are annoying, but not doing anything that's actively damaging to themselves, staff, or other inmates. So I think you could train correctional officials to manage those folks better. I mean, I think within the US context, that would be more like 20 to 30% of the folks who are in disciplinary segregation. And so I think if you can, that would be the first place that I would start experimenting in terms of how to decrease the use of solitary confinement and then sort of see where things go there. I mean, the pushback you'll get from correctional officials is that those folks require a tremendous amount of time to manage already, and that if you're engaging with them in essentially a more respectful way, that's going to be more time consuming. And so you'd have to alter your staff to inmate ratio. I mean, I think moving the use of disciplinary segregation for drugs, escapes, assaults on staff or other inmates, or other access to contraband, I just think it's a non-starter with correctional officials. And to be honest, like, I think there are pretty good reasons that it would be a non-starter. And so I think thinking about ways that you can manage sort of the lowest level things where it's someone who's difficult to manage, but there's nothing sort of explicitly wrong going on. Yeah? Either of you, right by each other.
I know you're not inclined to talk about the U.S., but
sure.
You said at the start that returning to incarceration rates in 1973 would take a very long time. I'm wondering whether that's a political fact or a demographic fact about how many people are already in the system, or why you're saying that.
So that is a super good question. I don't know why I'm still going back to the U.S. piece, but you said U.S. So okay. So there are a couple different things that are going on. The first thing is that within the U.S. context, we have a massive number of people who have already accumulated enough criminal justice contact that any additional infraction in society that they're picked up for is going to lead to a relatively long stay, likely in a prison rather than in a jail. And so there's a certain way in which we have essentially created a system where people's records are so long that even small things will lead to their incarceration risk being very high. And so there's just sort of path dependence there. The second thing is that there are real political obstacles to decreasing the incarceration rate quickly, right? So New York State has been decreasing its incarceration rate between 3 and 5% for the last, 10 to 12 years, I guess. Any spike in crime, especially violent crime, that you saw in New York State that corresponded with that would be really, really detrimental to politicians' careers. So there is an impediment there. I mean, to be honest, I think I think the discourse around the criminal justice system that liberals have disproportionately contributed to is also something that's going to be hard for us to overcome to decrease the incarceration rate. So when folks talk about decreasing the incarceration rate, they tend to focus on nonviolent drug offenders, right? So this is like the low-hanging fruit. But they tend to talk about it within the context of no real treatment in the community, limited labor market prospects, and without acknowledging the fact that folks with untreated addiction and mental health issues will often end up committing a more serious violent crime that lands them in a facility regardless. So that's the group that we focus on, and I actually think our capacity without broader social services systems for decreasing the incarceration rate there is relatively low. The folks that we don't want to talk about at all are folks who are convicted of violent crimes, but increases in sentence length for violent crimes explain about 50% of the prison boom. And there's not a way that we can seriously decrease the imprisonment rate in the US below about 3 to 350 per 100,000 without just slashing sentence length for violent crimes. So like by 50%, by 75%, by 90%. There's just not a way to do it. And I actually think that that's the biggest obstacle. Because I think we built up this discourse where there's like a certain type of like worthy offender who's like troubled in some way, but who we want to give a second chance. And then there are these like folks that are just dangerous and we can't let out into society. And I think it's like deeply problematic for decreasing the imprisonment rate. The other thing that's deeply problematic about it is that when you look at folks who have been convicted of different types of crimes, and then you look at their within household behavior, so you can do this a little bit in the Fragile Families data, folks who have been convicted of violent crimes and folks who have been convicted of non-violent drug crimes are virtually identical in their violence against the women that they have children with, in their sort of core parenting behaviors, and in their drug and alcohol use and abuse. And so we're talking about folks as being two totally different groups when they're very similar groups of folks who just happen to get convicted of different crimes. So, all right.
Okay, on that
Sorry.
note.
Sorry, cheery, isn't it?
Let's stop here with the public questions. Let's thank our speaker and then hang on.